Well, hello, everyone, and good day to you all. I'm beside myself with excitement at having the honor to introduce you to and talk with one of the legends of the world of exploration, Colonel John Blashford-Snell. His expeditions, of which incredibly there are over 70, or through the most remote and frankly scariest far-flung corners of the world. They range from navigating the length of one of the world's most deadly rivers in Africa to transporting a piano to a remote tribe in the Amazon jungle. They're the stuff of boys' own adventures. But there's more to these expeditions than just daring do, as we're about to find out. For when not preoccupied with charging elephants, bandits, or giant whirlpools, he's focusing on his commitment to the countless community aid projects he oversees in these remote parts. He also fulfills environmental, medical, and scientific objectives. And this he doesn't do alone. Over the course of time, John has taken some, I think I'm right in saying this, John, 50,000 participants on various expeditions, mostly young, a lot of them underprivileged, and teaching them just the gnarly ropes of exploration and with it an understanding and respecting for our planet. And I'm very happy to notice that he recruits them not for their array of 4A-star A-levels, but rather their initiative and drive. You could say he was looking for purpose, passion, and grit. So, back on the safer turf of the UK here, John supports and works with numerous charities, as well as a diversity of courses, which we'll touch upon as well. And somehow found the time to publish 15 books. And we'll cover that as well. He's owned some unusual cars. You can ask about that later. Designed a raft and a hat, both used in expeditions to this day. Oh, and he has some really quirky side interests. Sorry, John, but we've got to cover those as well. So, hello, John.
Good morning, everybody.
Could we start this journey with your childhood spent on, it sounds idyllic, on the island of Jersey, and perhaps this set you on course, so to speak?
Yes, indeed. Well, I was brought up during the war, of course, in the Herefordshire vicarage, because my father was an army chaplain and was away at the war, and we couldn't live in Jersey because it was occupied by the Germans. But as soon as the war was over, I went back to Jersey. I went to Victoria College, and then I stayed there until I went to Sandhurst and on into the army. But I really had a pretty idyllic childhood because living in my paradise in the Herefordshire vicarage, I had a gang of young people whose sole mission was to defeat the Hun if ever they invaded Herefordshire. And we used to go out and defend the vicarage apples and defend the orchards and so on. And we were all rather disappointed when the war ended because there were no Germans to hunt down. But nevertheless, I went over to Jersey, and at Victoria College, I became fascinated with diving. And my heroes were somebody called Hans Hass, who was an Austrian, I think, a diver, and also, of course, the famous French divers as well. And eventually we got a little club together and saved our money, and we bought an aqualung. And that made a huge difference in my life because it extended my lungs through diving, and it enabled me to get rid of the affliction that I had from youth of being asthmatic. And if I hadn't got rid of that, I wouldn't have got into the army. But this diving I was doing, of course, extended my lungs, and I became fighting fit, and I eventually got into the army.
And also, it equipped you, if Ben could bring up the slide, with the qualifications of being an excellent horseman.
Actually, that's to be honest with you, that's not on a horse. That's on an elephant.
Okay, we'll move to the next slide, and I think we can move from an elephant to a horse. Thank you, Ben. That's it. And actually,
that was Cromwell, one of the horses I rode in Mongolia some years ago.
So we're riding a round head with a round helmet on.
Yes, it's actually a polo helmet, and it was in the days before we wore sort of safety riding helmets. But I reckon the polo helmet was as good as anything. And in fact, on one occasion, some years before, when I was in the Darien Gap in Central America, I was on a mule, and the mule tripped over a vine, threw me over its head straight into a tree. And I hit the tree head first. And if I hadn't had a pith helmet on, I'd have cracked my skull. So they're very useful things. Also,
they're not just useful, but I've had a comment that it's very dashing as well.
Well, they're also useful for collecting things. I remember once I had to collect some small snakes, and the only place I could put them was take my hat off and put the snakes inside the hat.
Oh. Next time I'll make sure I'll check my riding hat before I put it on if I'm near you. Now, actually, I'm sure one person who is adamant that you should wear a hat when you go on these adventures is your wife, because it was through the army that you met Judith, wasn't it?
Yes, Judith was an officer cadet in the Women's Royal Army Corps, which was then based quite near to Sandhurst. And naturally, we gravitated from Sandhurst to meet the girls. And I always remember that on one cocktail party when we met, she was in some state of distress because she had a map reading exam the next week, and she didn't think that she was going to pass. She wasn't very good at reading maps. So I said to her, well, if you'd like to come off to the woods with me over the weekend, I'll show you how to read a map.
What an opening line. And actually,
she passed her exam.
I bet she did. You're going to get some offers there from our viewers, John, I'm sure. Well, talking of map reading, could we move on to one of your earlier expeditions, which was a massive and very significant one and the next slide we could bring up as well. We're going to move on from Jersey, moving beyond life in Dorset to the Blue Nile. And it was the first descent which you led as part of a British Army expedition. Now, here we have one of the hazards. I mean, crocs, hippos, disease, raging rapids and rabid bandits are what springs to my mind from all accounts. How did you find it?
Well, the big problem with the Blue Nile was, of course, it hadn't been navigated. And although it's called the Blue Nile, as you'll see from the picture, it's rather brown in color because of all the mud that comes down from Lake Tana and eventually flows into Egypt and, of course, creates the fertile land on which the Egyptians grow all their crops. But our problem was that we had to find a way of navigating this river so that we could explore the minerals and the resources and the people and the animals. And this had been brought about at a personal request of the Emperor, Haile Selassie.
Oh, the Emperor of Ethiopia.
Yes, he was luckily had befriended my godfather, and as a result of that, I got an invitation to take a party of cadets out to Ethiopia. This was followed on by several other expeditions, and finally, the Emperor said to me one day, I'd like you to explore my Blue Nile. Well, that's rather like asking an average hill walker to climb Everest. And I rather dodged the question, but I went back to England and a letter arrived from Haile Selassie to the Ministry of Defense requesting that we do this expedition.
Ooh,
and my general, who was a very forceful character, sent for me, and he said, we've had a letter from Haile Selassie, the Emperor of Ethiopia, King of Kings, chosen lion of the tribe of Judah, and also, by the way, a field marshal in the British Army. What do you think of this expedition? I gather you've seen the river. And I said, yes, General, I have seen it. It's very dangerous. It's full of bandits. There are lots of crocodiles and hippos. And there's even said to be radioactive gas coming down from the cliffs around it. And it's a mile-deep gorge. And he said, stop. He said, you're being negative. I don't like negative officers. He said, I think this is just the sort of challenge that the army needs today. We should do it. He said, we'll have a committee to run the expedition. He said, I shall be chairman and you can be secretary, and I don't see any need for anyone else. And so he was a mildly autocratic sort of chap. And that was it. The expedition was launched from the Royal Military College of Science, and it took, of course, zoologists and biologists and botanists and geographers to explore this river. But as this picture shows, the problem was to get down the river. And various expeditions had tried and failed. And we thought that perhaps rubber boats would do the job. So I went to see the Avon Rubber Company at Llanelli in South Wales. And I said, could we borrow some of your yachting tenders? And I told them I wanted to go down the worst river in the world. And they reluctantly agreed to lend me 6 of these yachting tenders. And we turned these into whitewater boats. To make sure they didn't sink, we actually put large valves in the side, and through those valves, we inserted football bladders. So we had sort of tubes within tubes, and they were pretty unsinkable.
Modifications. And did it have to be, the point is it has to be bendy, I imagine, to mitigate this turbulence?
They had to be very flexible, and of course we had to control them. They didn't actually need much control, because once you got into the current of the river, you were just swept along with it. But we did learn a lot about navigating rivers, and this was the start of whitewater rafting as it became known. And of course, it took off all over the world. And the Avon Company then started manufacturing whitewater boats galore.
I hope they named them after you, like the Scottish lifeboat.
No, I don't think they did. But they've always lent us boats whenever we needed them.
So you were the pioneer of whitewater rafting. What a thrill. And
by accident.
By accident. But sometimes the greatest dimensions are through accident, are they not? And also, incredibly, then you didn't have any disasters by way of injuries or losses.
Well, we did. Sadly, we lost one man who was drowned, but not on the main river. He was drowned crossing a tributary. And that was a great sadness to us.
Even sadder that it was not on the major river with all the... Yes. But nevertheless, did you have your vehicles with you at various points as well? The Range Rovers?
Well, no, the Range Rover hadn't been invented at that stage, but we had Land Rovers provided by the Army. And of course, later on, we became involved with the Range Rovers. And that led us on to the epic crossing of the infamous Darien Gap between Panama and Colombia.
Yes, we have a slide of that, Ben. As far as I understand, here we are, British flag flying at all times.
And the Panamanian.
Yeah, Panamanian. So as I understand it, this was part of a from the tip of America, North America, down through the south. So that's the longest route in the world, isn't it, or road?
17,000 miles. It's the longest road. But the road was broken between Panama and Colombia by this awful gap, which was about 250 miles long, of jungle and swamps and mosquitoes and crocodiles and snakes and creepy crawlers and bandits and everything. And it was called the Darien Gap. And no one had actually managed to get vehicles right the way through and through the Atrato swamp that was in Colombia, which was about the size of Wales. And a Colombian committee issued a challenge to the British government saying, why don't the Brits take this on and show us how to do it? Well, a very interesting committee was set up in London. And after much negotiation, I was told to get on with it and do the job. My boss, who was the head of the Royal Engineers, said this was a wonderful idea and good training for the troops. And so we formed a team of soldiers and scientists, and many of the soldiers were, of course, Royal Engineers. And we then approached Land Rovers, and they said, we've got this new vehicle, this wonderful car, the Range Rover, and we love it, test it out. We'll lend you two of them. So the Royal Air Force flew the two cars to Alaska, and we had a crew from the 17th, 21st Lancers who drove the cars down to Panama. And there we met up with all the sappers, and we then had to get through the 250-mile gap. Unfortunately, the rains, which are notoriously unreliable in Latin America, were late. And it was still raining when we got there in January, when it should have been the dry season. And so we went into the gap, which was like the sort of battlefield of the Somme. It was an absolute morass. And the vehicles began to stick, and the tires perhaps weren't quite the right sort, and the tires stuck, and the engine revved, and something went bang in the middle, which was the differential. And it went bang with such force that the teeth from the differential came up through the floors of the car, rather like shrapnel. And we broke 9 back axles. Well, this was a major technical setdown, and we then had to get rovers back in England to build a new type of differential and fly them out and parachute them in with a technician from the works and sort the problem out. But whilst all that was going on, we bought an old second-hand Land Rover that had been a bit battered. We stripped off every spare bit of metal, and we used that as a pathfinder to go ahead with the sappers to find the path through the jungle, so that when the Range Rovers got moving, they could race along this track. And that's more or less what happened. But it was a very close one thing, because we had all these problems, and in fact, we had just 100 days to cross the gap before the main rain started, and we made it on the 99th day.
Ooh, narrow whisker. But also it shows the importance of resourcefulness on these challenges. And also, interestingly, no matter how great the perils, the dangers, and the physical exertion is, that you've still got this quagmire of logistics to contend with and overcome. So it's a lot to do with tactics and resourcefulness, isn't it?
Yes, and we had to find a way of carrying our fuel. And we luckily had an Army Air Corps Beaver aircraft that could parachute fuel, but we still needed means of carrying the fuel in the gap. And we had 28 pack ponies that carried the petrol. So the horses were carrying the petrol for the cars.
Good Lord, it was quite a complex procedure, isn't it? You do need the qualities of a field marshal there. And in fact, if the Darien Gap, could one say that was, I think you've said, is one of the hardest challenges that you've ever undertaken and succeeded in, I have to add. Would it therefore be fair to say that perhaps the most dangerous one, if anyone out there can believe that John took on a yet more dangerous challenge, was the navigation of one of the deepest and the most dangerous river in the world, the Congo, which I think translates, correct me if I'm wrong, John, as the river that swallows all rivers, and probably nearly swallowed you. Certainly swallowed a couple of your predecessors, because it was the 100th anniversary of Stanley attempting to navigate the Congo. And if the river didn't get them, then I think some cannibals did, didn't they? But tell us, and Ben, can you bring up the Congo?
Well,
thank you.
In those days, the Congo was called Zaire, but President Mobutu changed the names of everything. And they had a terrible disease, and they still have it in that area, called river blindness, which is caused by a nasty little insect that gets under the blood, lays its eggs, the eggs gravitate to the back of your eye, and you go blind. Yeah. About 20 million people in Africa were suffering from this. And we took out a team of medical and ophthalmic experts to try to find a way of curing this disease. But of course, to get through this huge country, we had only one way, and that was to navigate the river. And the river, the Congo, ran for about 2,700 miles from the southern borders of the Congo right up to the Atlantic. And so we needed special sorts of boats. And the picture you've got here is of the giant inflatables that we purchased from the Americans. These were actually bridging pontoons, and we installed engines in them. And we took 3 of these out, and we had, in this particular one, a Royal Marine crew. That's why it's flying the white ensign. We had our scientists and our support groups and so on. So we came down the river carrying all our gear on these huge inflatable craft. And they actually got through some of these incredible rapids where you had waves up to 20 feet high, an enormous current. And this was
apparently giant whirlpools.
Giant whirlpools. One of our smaller boats, one of the reconnaissance craft that was made by Avon, was coming downriver when they flipped on a wave and were sucked into one of these giant whirlpools.
Yeah.
And the men were clinging on the outside of the boat. It was sucked down into this vortex, rather like sort of water going down a plug hole. And they were clearly going to all be drowned. The second boat coming up behind saw the problem and raced over and managed to pull the men into the second boat, overloading it seriously, but nevertheless, they then corkscrewed back up the whirlpool and escaped at the other end. The actual stricken boat was swept underwater and was eventually reappeared about a mile downstream. It just popped up from nowhere, badly damaged, the engine had gone, and there were no people. And I thought when I saw it, my goodness, I've lost all those men. But there they all were, the 6 men in one boat, all thanks to the courage and skill of a Royal Marine. And Neil Rickard, who now I think works in a garage, but he was a corporal of the Royal Marines at the time. And I'm glad to say that as a result of this, he got the Queen's Gallantry Medal.
And very deservedly so as well. My goodness. But obviously you achieved a lot in terms of the medical aspect. And also I think that there was some pretty exotic wildlife and flora and fauna, including, Ben, if you could bring up, yes, that photograph seems to be taken very close up, John, of and that was around the Congo, wasn't it? On the same.
Yes, that was actually on the eastern borders of the Congo. And Jeremy Mallinson, who was the deputy director then of the Jersey Zoo, had come with us on the expedition because he was particularly interested in seeing the mountain gorilla. And he went into the forest with the young Belgian soldier you see in the picture and was suddenly confronted by this enormous creature. And his name was Casimir. And he weighed about 400 pounds. He was actually completely friendly.
How tall was he standing up?
He would probably be about 5 or 6 foot, I would think. But he weighed around 400 pounds. And later on, we got to know him quite well because there's a famous film clip that I use in my lectures, which shows Casimir when he was handed a baby gorilla that had been found by the game wardens. It had been abandoned by its mother, and they tried to reintroduce it to the wild. So they took this baby into the forest and tried to reintroduce it. And Casimir rushed out and grabbed the baby and carried it back into the forest. And there, 2 female mountain gorillas tried to nurse it, but sadly, they hadn't got any milk at the time, and the baby died. But it's the most remarkable piece of film that I regularly use when I'm lecturing.
It sounds very moving because it's they welcomed and embraced it as part of the family, or part of the community. Which
yes, indeed. And we did a lot of other studies of animals, one of which was with a creature called the bonobo. And the bonobo is actually a type of small pygmy chimpanzee. And the scientists were terribly keen to find a bonobo. And one day when I was sitting at the side of the river writing my log, a couple of Congolese ladies arrived wearing dresses with pictures of President Mobutu upside down. And they said, they kept saying to me, Buckingham Palace, Buckingham Palace. And I eventually discovered that they had actually been to Buckingham Palace because they were ladies in waiting to Madame Mobutu. So they invited my assistant, Pam Coulter, and I to dinner. And when we went there, we were dragged away from the radios where we'd been listening out for messages about people searching for this bonobo. But anyway, we had a break. We went out to dinner. And during dinner, I suddenly felt a hand on my knee under the table. And I looked at the lady opposite me, and to my amazement, both her hands were on the table. And I thought, well, this is extraordinary. And then I felt this hand creeping up my trouser leg. And I thought, this has gone far enough. So I reached under the table and I grabbed the hand and pulled it up. And out came a little monkey. And I said, oh, you've got a baby chimpanzee. And my hostess said, oh, no. She said, it's not a baby, it's a very old one. And I realized that I had discovered the only bonobo that we found on the expedition.
No. And what a wonderful way of discovering it as well. Now, interestingly, actually, you're obviously very curious about some of these wildlife that are teetering on the side of mythological, should I say? And yet, here we go. I was going to talk next about Guyana. We're going to go back to that. But mythology behind, in fact, you're a keen participant. Is it called cryptology?
Cryptozoology.
Let alone this extraordinary creature that you discovered, also tracking a 20-foot dragon in Papua New Guinea. And then in 1992, the Mongolian Amarasana expedition, sighting of the almas, which are supposed to be Yeti-like creatures. And also, I was especially, being a Scot, intrigued to see that you scanned Loch Ness, wondering, I presume, about the Loch Ness Monster.
We did indeed.
Did you find
Loch Ness was an interesting story because the late Sir Peter Scott, whom I knew, was very keen on discovering the real truth behind the Loch Ness legend. And he got me involved with it because in those days I was commanding an army regiment and we had access to helicopters and so on. But to get up to Loch Ness and create a real survey, we needed two sorts of craft. First of all, we needed a barge with very advanced sonar equipment for detecting things underwater. So we got an old Humber barge, fitted it out with a sonar, which was used for finding fish. And then we needed something up in the air that would hover above the barge. And the Goodyear company very kindly lent us one of their airships. It was a blimp, as they call them. And so we flew the airship over the top of the barge. And when the barge got a reading on the sonar, they signaled us and we hovered over, hoping to see whatever it was breaking the surface. And I got this very exciting message one day saying, there's something there, it's coming up to the surface. It's about so far down and so on, and it's getting closer and closer and closer. And it's 14 feet from the surface. And we were sitting in the airship gazing down, but unfortunately, Loch Ness has a consistency rather like strong coffee. You couldn't really see anything below the surface. And the wretched thing stopped about 10 feet from the surface and went back down again. So we never saw what it was that came up from the depths from about 800 feet down and then dived down again. But that's the mystery. There was something there. My own theory is that it could well be something like a sturgeon, because Loch Ness has access to the sea on both ends through the canals, the Caledonian canals. And I've always thought a big fish like a sturgeon could come in to Loch Ness and be there, and that would account for some of the stories of the monster.
Yes, and sturgeon are quite deep water fish, are they? Because has anyone actually found the very bottom of Loch Ness?
Oh, yes, they've been down. We had another expedition we did. We had a robot, and it went down. And one of the things that we did discover was that on the loch bed, there was a thriving population of Arctic char.
No.
And of course, that would have provided the food chain for a monster to live on, which people didn't know about.
So it also adds up. Absolutely.
We also found the wreck of an RAF bomber that had landed on the loch during the war.
So it's interesting, isn't it, how many of your expeditions, you're looking for one thing and you discover so many other things as well.
Indeed.
Quite often, I don't know if you have this, but when people say to me, well, why are you going to so-and-so place or doing X, Y, Z? What are you hoping to discover? And more often than not, I have to say, well, I have no idea until I get there. However, one of your most memorable expeditions, and Ben, if we could move to the next slide, was Guyana. And here you are making fairly hard work upstream. Yes, where you took a piano all the way through the forest and jungle to the Wai tribe. Is that true?
Yes, we'd gone out to assist the Wai in a remote part of Guyana at the request of the government. They were suffering from malaria and dental problems, and they wanted a medical expedition. So we went out there and did what we could to assist these people. They were delightful. They spoke a rather quaint sort of English, sort of like early Victorian. But when we were about to leave them, the chief priest, and they were Christian religion, they had a Christian religion, said to me, would you do me a favor when you come back, because I hope you will, would you please bring me a grand piano? So, what?
A grand piano?
Have you ever seen a grand piano? And he said, yes, I've seen a picture of one. He said, you see, the young people in the tribe are very musical. And they've heard about the bright lights and all the girls and so on in the capital, on the coast, 350 miles away. And they want to go there. But they've got no trade to offer. They've got no way of earning a living. And they'll all end up in problems with the police and drugs and everything else. So he said, if we could get them something to really give them an interest for their music, like a grand piano, it would keep them here in the tribe. I said, well, I can't promise it. They weigh about 800 pounds. How we'd get it to you, God knows. Anyway, I went back and I was giving a presentation at a West End hotel. And I mentioned this. I said, they want a grand piano. And to my horror, the general manager of the hotel group said, I will give you a grand piano. And the Biwi, the airline that flies to the Caribbean, said, we'll fly it for you. So there I was with an 800-pound grand piano, which we had tropicalized. I got some Royal Engineers to come along too, and also a doctor who'd been in the army and thankfully could play the piano and tune it. So he came as well. We flew the grand piano out to Guyana, and then we put it in a little tiny freight plane and flew it up to the nearest airstrip that we could get to the Wai tribe. And we were assured that there would be 100 Wai waiting for us at the airstrip to help us carry the grand piano to their village. When we arrived, there were 6 of them, 3 of whom were under 12. And so we, the poor, unfortunate sort of sweating Europeans, had to drag this grand piano on a sledge across the savannah, into the jungle, over the ravines, and then get it up a river because the village had moved onto a high ground of a hill nearby. And the only way we could get there was to take it up a river. And the BBC also sent a film crew because they thought it was going to be a wonderful disaster, the film. So the whole thing was filmed, and it's still on YouTube now. It's called The Grand Adventure. And we got this grand piano in a very large dugout canoe. It was in a packing box, of course. And we took it up the river, shot the rapids going upstream, and finally through some creeks and to the foot of the mountain. When we got to the foot, at last, there were the 100 YY waiting for us. And I said, why weren't you at the airstrip? And they said, we didn't think you'd ever come. And so we dragged it up the hill and we installed it. It made a few bongs at the time, and we thought we must have broken all the notes and so on. But the doctor got to work and he reassembled the piano, and he taught the young men there to play the piano. And we then had a satellite phone, and we made a recording of a concert, which we sent by satellite phone to the BBC, and people couldn't believe that there in the middle of the jungle was this grand piano. But the good thing that came about it was that the BBC film was shown worldwide. An American charity, Conservation International, heard about this, and they donated $2 million, which helped to turn the tribal territory into a reserve and keep out all the illegal loggers and diamond miners and so on, and preserve the wildlife of the rainforest. So it had a good result, even though the piano didn't last more than a few years.
That's fantastic, John, because I mean, this is, I have a bee in my bonnet about explorers, expeditioners must carve a legacy that's of a lasting legacy of benefit to others. And to think that you achieved all that of such value on that particular expedition, let alone the piano, which of course I think you had to go back to retune, didn't you?
Yes, we had a second expedition when I recruited adventurous piano tuners. And that was quite amusing because I always remember one of them was a large lady who was a bit of a naturist, and she loved bathing naked in the river in the morning. And I had two soldiers from the Guyana army with me who were Seventh-day Adventists. And they used to spend a lot of time sitting reading their Bible, quite naturally. And one morning, very early, they were sitting down by the river reading the Bible, and this lady came racing through the village, starkers, and plunged into the river. Of course, the chaps were absolutely shaken rigid, and they spent a week reading the Bible before they would do anything else.
I thought you were going to say they jumped in after to rescue. Now, we're fast running out of time, which is so frustrating, but we can't miss out. And talking of legacies and important initiations that you have instigated, Operation Drake and Rally. And Ben, if we can skip the wildly exciting elephant tusker, which is another story we could always come back to, onto this here is Operation Drake. And this was one of the two major and very famous, respected youth projects that you initiated under the patronage of His Royal Highness Prince of Wales.
Yes, Prince of Wales wanted to give the challenges of war in peacetime to young people and create young leaders. Nobody wanted a war, but he thought young men and women could face up to challenge and become really good citizens and come back and do something worthwhile in life. So we had an expedition around the world. Operation Drake had a flagship, the Brigantine Eye of the Wind that you see here.
Magnificent.
And we were supported by the Goodyear Company again with their airship. And we carried out scientific and community aid projects all over the world. And then these young people went back into their communities. They weren't all British. They were from Commonwealth countries, America and so on. And they tried to do what they could to help the schools, elderly people, the sick, and so on. So it was a huge success. And when it was almost over, the Prince of Wales said to me, "You can't stop now. You must do it again. Make it bigger." And so Operation Rally was created, which still goes on today, called Rally International.
We have a picture of that as well, a very different vehicle.
Yes, and then the government and the city of Hull, they kindly bought us this boat, which was an oil research vessel, we converted it into a scientific research ship, and that went around the world with us for 4 years as our flagship and carried the scientists and the crew. And we also had a sailing ship as well with us for the young people, and that was a huge success.
Mm. And did that lead on to, or was completely separate to the Scientific Exploration Society, which you founded in the late 60s?
Well, the Scientific Exploration Society had been founded really based at Santos in 1969. And it has gone on, but of course, with Operations Dragon Valley, it has got larger and larger and larger. And they outgrew the Scientific Exploration Society. So we formed separate charities for them, and the SES continued, but tended to concentrate on helping the older people, very irreverently called the Winkleys by the younger people. That's what we do today. Okay. But we also provide bursaries for younger people as well. So the SES is a thriving organization, chaired by one of the young men who was with me years ago, who's now a bit older, Neil Lawton, and it has a committee. It's backed by most of the leading explorers in the world who have formed an honorary advisory board, including your good self and others. And it does great work for not only young people, but taking older people who want to do something worthwhile when perhaps the birds have flown the nest and they're not sort of too old to get on and do things. So we take people right up to 80 on expeditions, providing they're reasonably fit and say they can run to catch a bus.
So anyone listening and interested in that, off the top of my head, I think if you Google the Scientific Exploration Society.
That's right. It has a website. And we have meetings. We're just starting to have meetings in London again. They've been suspended due to the pandemic, and we've been having all our meetings by Zoom. But later this month, we're having one in London. One of the young men who sailed a replica of a Phoenician sailing ship in Africa and around Africa, and also recently across the Atlantic to America, Philip Beale is going to be lecturing. So the SES has started again to give actual live lectures as well as the Zoom ones.
And I have some questions coming in, John, but before we answer the questions, just very quickly, now's your opportunity if you want to mention in, say, a minute flat, in a race against time, the charities that you would like to tout.
Well, the Scientific Exploration Society is my top one, but I'm also president of Just a Drop, which is a water charity, which does wonderful work in installing clean drinking water and sanitation, particularly for indigenous people all over the world. And that's been going on in spite of the pandemic, using local resources. I also try to help the army charities, of course, and I've got various youth ones. I've got a group of lovely young people in South London, in the Brixton area, and another group up in Liverpool. The Liverpool one is concerned really with helping in young people who are slightly underprivileged and so on. And they've got about 40,000 that have been through the system there. And
yes.
So I'm a mixture.
Yes.
I'm really a mixture of helping things in the green and the concrete jungle.
And I've been to your concrete jungle one or two as well, the Brixton one. And I guess if people are interested in supporting them or just curious about them, they'll find references to them on your website.
Yes, indeed. It's on the look up Don Blashford-Snell, and it's got references there.
Jolly good. Well, I think now we're going to have to move on to my own technical challenge, which is some questions that are coming in. And I'll just throw in some topics which, as Tempus Fugit, we didn't have time to cover. But for instance, John's interested in, I think it's called the Ghost Society. You've designed an expeditioner's hat. You have a curious history with vehicles, if I can say that. So now, and we skimmed through many of your fascinating expeditions just because of time. So people might want to ask about books as well. And I might at this stage say that you've also got an autobiography out with a rather Kipling-esque title. So is that on your website? It's called Beyond the Ranges. Is that right, John?
Well, the book, the latest autobiography is Something Lost Beyond the Ranges. And I'm working on my new one, which is coming out in October, being published by Bratt, which is going to be Utmost East to Utmost West. And that is an anthology of the expeditions, really carrying on from my last book, which was really up to about 1994. So I've had to write quite a lot more about the new expeditions and also going back to one or two of the older ones.
Well, a huge respect for actually managing to keep sitting down and write. I haven't got my first one out quite yet. But poor Emma's question, I think, got muted. Emma was asking you, John, whether you think there are any places left in the world not yet explored or discovered.
Well, there's certainly a lot underwater. And indeed, some parts of the rainforest, hopefully, if it's not all destroyed by man's wanton destruction. Yeah. And of course, some of the mountains areas, indeed, even parts of what used to be the Soviet Union. And you yourself have been on Lake Baikal and up there in that region. There's still parts of the world that haven't been scientifically explored. Although armies may have marched through them. So I would say it's a mixture of underwater, jungle areas, and a few mountain regions.
Okay. And lots of comments about fantastic, incredible stories. You've done so much good. 2 engineers here. People asking for links to your adventures. Somebody here from India, Ashfield. Absolutely fascinating. I'm looking for PhD opportunities, and map reading is going to be essential. I think she's picking you up on that one, John. Would you recommend any good courses, other than coming into the woods with you, that is?
Well, map reading was unfortunately, because of all these sat-navs and devices these days, map reading has been rather forgotten, but I think it's essential that people continue to read maps. And indeed, if you go on an outward bound course, of course, you'll find all about map reading, or indeed even the Duke of Edinburgh's award schemes have, and the Scouts, they still use maps, and they teach people to use maps. So all the Army cadets, all the Sea cadets, I mean, they're going back to the basics. And so I do think, in spite of modern technology, it's very essential that people can use a map.
Well, as you and I both know, that often in these far-flung places, technology is not to be relied upon. And it also rather blunts your sense of intuition as well. Give me a map and compass any day, I say. Well, I think that's it, except that, I can't resist. There's a question from Barbara Snell. When have you been your most frightened on an expedition?
Well, Barbara, I'm wondering whether you're the same Barbara that I knew years ago, who was my lecture agent. If you are, wave your hand. No, it's not. Anyway, there was frightening time on expeditions, I think. Well, you know, when you face animals that are wild, this can be quite scary. But the most frightening thing of all is when you face men who are out to kill you. And I remember on the Blue Nile when we were attacked twice. That was really pretty scary. And once or twice in South America, we've had tight moments with hostile people. And the great thing, of course, is to try and calm people down. When I was in Papua New Guinea, I remember we were instructed there that if you found yourself facing people in the jungle who you couldn't necessarily see, but were hidden behind the foliage with a tight bow ready to shoot an arrow at you, the thing you must do is to look peaceful and put down your hands and put some gift out. So we used to put out things like cigarette lighters and gift mirrors and so on for them, and walk away slowly, showing your hands were open, that you were not having any sort of weapon against them, and try and calm them down. But the one thing that I did find, which was particularly useful, was I got a small box from a joke shop that was a laughing box. And if I could turn on this laughing box, it would go, and of course, it's very hard for somebody to kill you when they're laughing. So if you could make people laugh, I used to turn on this laughing box and play it to them. And regardless, they couldn't speak English, they could still laugh.
I can see lots of laughing faces on my screen at that story. And now Humphrey Hawksley, no relation with Cinder, as we discussed before, would like to know whether the Mongolian expedition is still on for this year.
Yeah, at the moment, yes, it is. It's from the 26th of June to the 15th or 16th of July. You've got to be able to ride a horse, of course. We're in regular touch with our agents in Mongolia, and the laws about entering the country are just changing. And I think the latest one I saw is you're going to be able to go into Mongolia, providing you have a COVID vaccination certificate. But I haven't actually seen it on their website. So if anyone is thinking of going to Mongolia, they should check the website for the Mongolian embassy in London and find out themselves, because the restrictions imposed by the pandemic are chopping and changing around the world. We've just had to delay our expedition once again to Bolivia because of a huge spike in COVID in South America in the last week or two.
Yes. But I wholly agree with your approach as well, and to everybody with their lives, that despite COVID, you just got to keep planning and hope for the best. I have one final question, which really you've sort of almost answered earlier, which is somebody was so inspired by you, they'd quite like to know how to get into the world of exploration. And that's from a C. Hewitt.
I would say as a young person, the first thing is go on an outward bound course, because if you do that, you learn about your strengths and your weaknesses at a time when you can build on the strengths and correct the weaknesses. And that, I would say, is the first effort for a young person. After that, to get involved with a reputable organization. For slightly older people, there's obviously Raleigh International, and there's the British Exploring Society, which is again for young people. And then, of course, you've got the Duke of Edinburgh's Award, which does extremely good work. To gradually work your way up to that and get your experience on their sort of expeditions. And you also meet people through organizations like the Royal Scottish Geographical Society, the Royal Geographical Society. You meet others who've been on expeditions, and that's how the various opportunities open. Or come to the SES lectures and meet people there.
Yes, they're very inspiring, the SES lectures, and you never know, you might discover that you have a John Blashford-Snell qualities within. And John, we have to all thank you. The messages that are coming in to say how much good you've done and how inspirational you are. I mean, I can't possibly read them all out. And I think the only thing to say is that we're actually, those of us who've been listening in are exhausted, feel as if we've been on a round the world expedition with you. And we really salute your achievements and the legacy that you have carved out for people of all ages from all walks of life. We take our pith helmets off to you and like to say thank you very much, John.
Thank you. Thank you. Good luck, everybody. Thank you.
And now I'm just going to do Operation Mop Up with a few little admin points, which is, I think there has been some links sent through everyone for John's website, which is johnblashfordsnell.org. Is that right, John?
Yeah.
I think. And also there's free access to the Goldster's book club via the Purpose, Passion and Grit till February. And I think I'm correct in saying that you can also access a recording of this interview. And I think that's it. We'll all think of lots of questions to ask you afterwards, but we're going to have to close it now. We've overrun, of course. John, thank you very much. And thank you, everyone, for listening. Bye.
Bye.